Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and our guest today is the director of the Soho Forum debates. He's a former writer for Barron's magazine. He is an all-around great guy, very bright, and he's going to talk to us today about Adam Smith. Gene Epstein. Welcome here.
An honor, Michael, to be making a second appearance on the Rational Egoist. Perhaps the most stimulating podcast available. And guess what? This is also on YouTube. You do videos as well, or is this just because you want to see me? I forget. Are you also available on video?
This goes to YouTube. It goes to Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts.
Oh, well, if it goes to YouTube, you mean they will be able to see us, although, of course, if they want to listen to it on podcast.
Yes, they can see us.
I didn't know you do both. Yeah. Tom Woods for many years actually only did podcasts.
No. I want everybody to see that amazing, handsome face of yours.
All right, Michael. I think your taste in men's looks leaves something to be desired.
But no, you're no relation to these other Epstein.
So I respond to your compliment with an insult. That's kind of rude of me. But let's proceed to the topic at hand.
Yeah. All right. The topic at hand is I just watched the debate that you had a few years back with Mark Skousen, the economist, and you were debating whether Adam Smith was the founder of capitalism. I don't know if that was exactly how it was worded, but your position was more nuanced. You weren't saying that Adam Smith didn't help. You were just saying there's others as well. I want you to start off though with giving 3 good points that Adam Smith makes.
Yeah, I want to do that, but of course, in my usual garrulous fashion, I want to say that I've reformulated my approach to Adam Smith a little bit since that debate. And by the way, I also debated the great Deirdre McCloskey. I don't know if that was ever recorded at Freedom Fest on the same subject.
Oh wow, I got to see that.
I'm not sure it was preserved. Probably it was. It was 2 years ago, and as I think I mentioned to you, but perhaps maybe I didn't. That afterwards, a bunch of young guys gathered around me, and they were just shaking their heads in disbelief, and they said, "You shredded her. You shred." The new word among young guys.
The vernacular.
Yeah, the great vernacular. You shredded her, and I couldn't believe the way you shredded her. Anyway, of course, she was defending Adam Smith, but the point is that I want to be able to say that he was not. He's been called the father. We were talking founder, the father of modern economics. And so I want to build on that and say, no, he was not the father of modern economics. He was one of the drunken uncles. Okay. Now, why was he a drunken uncle in broad brushstrokes?
Because he was Scottish?
What's Scott? What kind of a racist remark is that?
I don't know. They say the Irish like to drink, and the Scottish, you get Scotch. Maybe he was drinking a lot of Scotch. I don't know. I'm taking a guess.
All right, fair enough. I'll accept that racist remark, but I didn't mean it in that way. What I meant was, first of all, to be called the uncle of modern economics is an enormous honor. What are you? Are you the uncle of objectivism? Am I the uncle in any way of any kind of intellectual movement?
No, I'm the redheaded stepchild of objectivism. I'm afraid.
Okay, you're a student of objectivism, a promoter of objectivism. You stand on the shoulders of giants, but nobody stands. You're not an uncle. I'm not an uncle, and therefore, to call him an uncle is definitely an enormous honor. But he's not a father, he's an uncle. Why is he drunk? Why is he drunken? Because he could not get his story straight. The man was clearly not sober when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. He kept contradicting himself. He was deeply ambivalent about capitalism. On top of everything else, as I told you, he literally, on an important issue, contradicted his own lectures on economics that are as a matter of record on the issue of exchange value versus use value. So if you read that book, you're reading a brilliant guy who's clearly had a few too many, because he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about from one chapter to the next. It may be that I should cut to the chase and tell you a few things. Of course, I didn't mention my debate with Mark Skousen because I barely had enough time. Do you know that famously he begins with a beautiful, and I really do think it's beautiful, discussion of the great advantages of the division of labor. It's brilliantly stated, and it goes into all the nuances of it, and so on. But do you know that toward the end of the book, he's calling the division of labor the worst thing ever? That he's saying, let me quote, that he's saying that, give me a second. I'm going to quote, in the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a few very simple operations, frequently to one or two. He naturally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. He then talks about the torpor of his mind. I could go on, but I didn't respond to your question. I'm only saying this guy could not even make up his mind about the division of labor. On the one hand, it's a great thing. On the other hand, it turns the vast majority of people into stupid, ignorant people. And what kind of society is that? That's the beginning of the book, and that's till the end of the book. It's amazing. Okay, now I did indeed want to answer your question because I welcome it. What you've asked is, what do I like about Adams? Why is he an uncle? And again, it's a huge honor that I pay him, an uncle. By the way, it also means that if I were to recommend to a young person books on economics, I would see no need to recommend Adam Smith, because even though you and I, of course, love a lot of the great stuff in Adam Smith, it's not essential to your education because anything that he said that was beautifully put and that was very insightful has been said by others anyway. And so you don't have to waste time sort of sorting through the good stuff while having to cope with the incredible left-wing stuff. However, I want to establish my bona fides as somebody who loves great writing, who loves great phrase making, and who therefore will indeed call him an uncle, our Uncle Adam. Okay, so you wanted 3 quotes. And
I'm looking for three areas where you agree, but now you're gone for 10 minutes. You're just telling me what a jerk the guy is.
Michael, I'm trying to be a proactive subject to this interview.
All right.
I'm trying to give the listeners a complete perspective. The uncle and the drunkenness. Those are the 2 themes I'm going to pursue. So this gives the overview, And so, admittedly, when you interview me, your ability to frame it and to steer it in the right direction is all for naught. I take over and I frame it. And I think I framed it properly. Okay, but I'm going to respond to your question.
All right, that's good.
And I don't think I wasted the listeners' time.
No, it's wonderful.
Thank you. By elaborating on why he's a drunken uncle. Okay. Now, of course, the famous one, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk of them to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. Beautifully put. And of course, I do want to quote the great line about the invisible hand, which is an interesting comment in itself and goes on to elaborate a point that I think is especially good. So bear with me while I quote this one. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in so many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. I said, in other words, I like the sentences that follow because I think that there's a bit of wisdom in it that maybe you don't find in many other writers. As it was said of Bill Gates, he moved up the production possibility frontier with his operating system. So that far and away was probably his greatest contribution to conquering poverty in the world. That's what he did when he headed Microsoft. Then he went on to become a philanthropist, and some of the things that he subsidized and some of the governments he subsidized were not so great. So what's my point? My point is only that while it's nice that billionaires become philanthropists, we should probably never lose sight of the fact that the way they made their billions was probably the major contribution they made to all of us, including the poor people of the world, rather than what they did with their philanthropy, however nice and helpful that is. And I think that Adam Smith's slightly snarky remark, "I've never known much good done when they try to do good," I think that was very wise. With respect to the invisible hand, however, I think that you and I would probably hasten to add that once you've read Adam Smith on the invisible hand, once you have some sophistication and read Thomas Sowell or others, then the hand is visible. In other words, a lot of businessmen commendably and quite respectfully understand that by providing a service at a profit to other people, they are indeed contributing to the welfare of society. Therefore, the hand is visible to them. It's not invisible. So I only wanted to add that to the point. Perhaps you know that what is called Das Adam Schmidt problem, because the Germans raised it, is that they argue that Adam Smith in his first tome, which is tough reading. I never actually read every page. It's a little bit clotted. The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Uh-oh. Don't tell Skousen.
Oh, okay. Well,
that you haven't read every page.
Yeah, I said I probably skipped a page or two. I read most of it. And some of it has some great stuff. And by the way, Adam Smith in that book did talk about selfishness versus self-interest. The two terms are very different. Selfishness was not a good thing, but self-interest is, of course, a good thing. We all want people to be interested in themselves. But the Adam Smith problem is that supposedly in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he said that men are motivated by compassion, and in the Wealth of Nations, he says that they're all self-interested. They don't care about the world, but they're led by an invisible hand. There is a little bit of a contradiction there. But if that were his worst sin, I wouldn't call him drunk. I'm going to get to some of his worst sins. But let's see. I want to do one more quote. Oh God, there are two that are great, but two others that I had here. Indulge me, because
of course,
this is him at his best. First, the statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they are to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted, and not only to no single person, but to no council or senate, whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. In other words, he's beautifully putting the point that anybody who thinks that he can direct private capital for others, any politician, that those people who think so are probably the worst elements around. They're the worst to get on top. A great statement by Adam Smith. And finally, this one, by the way, some claim that it's actually a paraphrase and he never quite said it, but in a way it's my favorite line from him, and it's not from The Wealth of Nations, but it was quoted from him. Little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. All governments which thwart this natural course, which force things into another channel, or which endeavor to arrest the progress of society at a particular point, are unnatural, and to support themselves are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. Elegantly put, a nice nugget, a great piece of wisdom. And so I want to establish my bona fides in saying that when I call him one of the great uncles of modern economics, I want to point out two, and now I'm going to list the rogues gallery, Don Boudreaux, Deirdre McCloskey, Thomas Sowell, Michael Munger, William Easterly, and of course, Mark Skousen.
Why are they the rogues gallery?
I'm exaggerating a little bit by calling them the rogues. They're confused. Why? Because they are all people who have made contributions to my understanding of economics, Thomas Sowell especially, by the way, and yet, they are all to the last person devoted to the idea that Adam Smith was the founder, the father. Deirdre McCloskey, as you know, she crosses herself whenever she talks about Adam Smith. I don't know if you've observed that. She
No,
did.
I didn't know that.
When William Easterly spoke at the Cato Institute recently and lauded Adam Smith, Deirdre McCloskey got up and mentioned Adam Smith. But before you mention him, you cross yourself because he's a god. So I'm saying that I'm citing these brilliant people, and I stand aghast. Why? Because these are smart people, and they have to ask themselves, have you ever actually read that book from cover to cover? Don't you realize that there's so much in that book that gives aid and comfort to socialists and Marxists? Don't you realize that, in fact, as I mentioned in my debate, that Adam Smith has been cited against us by socialists and Marxists, and we lead with our chins when we call Adam Smith the great father of modern economics. Why? Because Amartya Sen, that was the example I cited, the Nobel Prize-winning interventionist and progressive.
Don't call him left wing.
What?
Don't call him left wing.
I know, because Mark Skousen can use that term, but he's insulting me. But nobody else can, because that's what happened. But then Mark Skousen made it clear that he never uses those terms, except, of course, when he's insulting Gene Epstein. And I guess he probably, insult Jeffrey Epstein in the same way, because he was a very hateful guy. But Jeffrey is no relation. I want you to know that. But that aside,
not even a drunk uncle.
He's well. Oh, look, come on. I'm thinking of changing my name to my wife's name, Kobayashi, because or maybe I'll call myself Liebowitz.
Hey, you could do worse. You'd still have the Jewish last name.
Yeah, that's right, and then I won't be confused with cousin Jeffrey. But anyway, my point is that these brilliant people don't realize that Amartya Sen, for example, that was the one example I cited. I didn't have a whole lot of time to cite the others. That Chomsky has done this, Noam Chomsky. They set us up by saying, hey, here's the father of modern capitalism, modern economics, the dad, the founder. And do you know, Amartya Sen said, do you know that he wanted to cap the loanable interest rate at 5%, that he believed in the usury laws, that he thought would be dangerous if we allowed anybody to borrow or lend at 8 or 9%? Wow, Amartya Sen really scored a point. The father of capitalism believed in the usury laws. So that's how we lead with our chins. As pro-capitalists, if we start talking about Adam Smith in that way. But if you recall, when there was a question asked from the audience about this issue, I said, look, I'm talking about the practical dangers to our cause of promoting Adam Smith as the founder of modern economics. But just for your own intellectual integrity, read that book. And recognize the guy is drunk. The guy on the one hand praises, in the example I just cited, which in a way is almost the most egregious. Why? Because he's so famous for having talked about how wonderful the division of labor is, but then at the end of the book, he talks about how it makes people stupid. And he talks about, by the way, I'll continue with that quote, when he talks about the vast majority of people who just have one job. He goes on to say that under the division of labor, the torpor of his mind renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. That's what the division of labor does. It gives people just one or two things to do and makes them stupid and ignorant. That's the division of labor. Now, Adam Smith would cheer about that. Come to think of it, I did briefly mention it in my debate with Mark Skousen, because Mark talked about how Adam Smith was an antidote to the idea that capitalism alienates, that the capitalism produces alienation. And I countered by saying, well, Adam Smith certainly indicated that the division of labor alienates in a certain way, that it turns people into stupid, mindless, ignorant people with minds that suffer from torpor. Okay, I'm belaboring that point, but I could go on to others.
Well, we're gonna, but I want to ask you first. The idea, first of all, capitalism aside, the idea that Smith was the first economist or the father of economics. I mean, am I wrong? I mean, Bernard Mandeville wrote on economics before Adam Smith. The physiocrats were writing on economics before Smith, and Richard Cantillon was writing, and the Spanish scholastics also were all writing on economics before Adam Smith, right?
Well, yes, indeed. Since you listened to my debate with Mark Skousen, I made that point. And I want, this gives me the opportunity to stress that much as I admire and learned so much from Murray Rothbard, and Murray Rothbard's very entertaining 2-volume history, intellectual history of economics, economic theory, he goes after Adam Smith, I think, in a kind of a vicious way. He doesn't grant that there are many great passages in Smith. I think he way goes overboard in his indictment of Smith, and therefore I don't want to be pigeonholed with Murray Rothbard. But Rothbard, of course, can be credited with pointing out the very thing that you just said, which is that not only did the Spanish scholastics way predate Smith in their discussion and theory of economics and capitalism. Not only did Richard Cantillon predate Smith, but they had insights and sophistication that Smith lacked. So Smith was a retrogression from them. The only other part of it, however, that I did acknowledge with Mark Skousen, and again, why I'll call him an uncle, is that Smith was better known. That I don't diminish completely the point about popularity and influence. Cantillon was, by the way, an Irishman who moved to Paris and wrote in French. You probably perhaps know that he was originally Irish, but he wrote in French, and he wrote. His book was published 25 years before Smith's book was published. Smith clearly read French. He briefly mentions Cantillon in The Wealth of Nations in another context, and so it's remarkable that Smith, in particular, could go after the idea that it's dangerous to lend, to allow people to lend at 10% because it's going to do harm, because Cantillon mocked the usury laws. Cantillon had already anticipated and known about this big predilection for capping the interest rate at a certain ceiling, and mocked that practice. And so perhaps, let's see, let me find that, because it's especially revealing. This is Adam Smith, and you're really going to be appalled at this part of it with respect to the way Smith discusses the usury laws. He writes, if the legal rate of interest in Great Britain was stuck so high as 8 or 10%, the greater part of the money which was to be lent would be lent to prodigals and projectors, who alone would be willing to give this high interest. Sober people would not venture into the competition. Sober people would not be able to borrow because if they wouldn't be able to afford to borrow at 8 to 10% because they're sober people. Cantillon wrote, nothing is more entertaining than the multitude of laws and rules made in every century on the subject of the interest of money, always unnecessarily by sages who barely understand the facts of commerce. So now let's go back to what Adam Smith was saying. If you allowed people to lend and to borrow at 9 to 10%, then the sober, who can only afford to borrow at 5%, which is what where Smith wanted to set the usury ceiling, that they would be shut out of the markets. Now, again, even if Cantillon had not already enlightened us about the usury laws and gone on, by the way, in when he further discussed the usury laws, he further said that entrepreneurs can borrow at 20% and make good money. And of course, he made the obvious point that when you lend your money, you care about two things, not just one thing. What you care about is getting a high rate of return, but you also care about the safety of your money.
Yeah, getting it back.
If you're going to lend to somebody at 12% or 13%, then that might be great. But what if that person can't pay you back? What if that person is some prodigal and projector? And obviously, we look for safety, not just a high rate of interest. And therefore, the sober people that Adam Smith is so concerned about will be able to say, yeah, I'm only paying 4%, I'm only paying 6%, but I've got a high credit rating. I've got I can give you almost a 99% promise that you're going to get your money back with interest. That jerk down the street who wants to borrow at 12%, who will pay you 12%, is a high risk investment. That's why we called high yield bonds junk bonds, if you may recall.
Yes, I recall.
Although, as a matter of fact, Marty Fritzen, whom you met at that party of mine, I guess I told you it was a joke. Martin Fritzen used to be. Yeah,
that's his book.
Well, okay. Now, Martin Fritzen used to run high yield bond department at Merrill Lynch, and I told you his joke. He said, "I'll call my bonds junk bonds if the AAA boys would be willing to call their bonds low yield bonds." And so obviously we're all sophisticated enough to know that about the trade-off between high rates of interest and risk. And that's why we have ratings for bonds. But the point is that I'm not even being anachronistic by condemning Smith for this colossal naivete. Because if he'd only read Cantillon, who actually does go on to discuss those very issues, that obviously, if you want to take a flyer on an entrepreneur who'll borrow at 20%, go do it, but realize you're taking a risk. All that was explained already in a book that Smith should have read. Certainly, there's an indication that he at least skimmed the book because he quotes Cantillon. He visited France. He met another guy named Turgot who wrote about that very thing as well, a Frenchman. So I mentioned, as you may recall, that we're engaging in two kinds of cover-ups. If we agree with Mark Skousen, Deirdre McCloskey, Michael Munger, all the rest of them about the greatness of Adam Smith, we're covering up the pioneering work done by the Spanish scholastics and by the French prior to Adam Smith. And of course, we're also covering up the long sections in that book by that drunken uncle, which give aid and comfort to the left wing. Well, yes.
Skousen made the false claim in the debate that Smith's argument was only a moral one, but clearly he makes an economic one as well. But in my view, Gene, Smith is wrong on both ends. It's immoral for the state to use force to prevent consensual contracts between people who aren't using violence, but also his idea that this is going to ruin the economy. The loan rates would be dictated by the supply and demand of the various parties and what we're willing to do. It's not some magical thing where if you allow it to go too high, it's going to screw everybody. But if you keep it too low, then you're limiting the supply and the demand is going to rush in for it, and you're going to have a shortage of credit. I mean, that seems to me like that's just basic economics. Now, you said, well, you point out somebody might argue, well, that's anachronistic, but not if Cantillon was writing about it, 20, 30 years before.
Turgot also, another French, a French free market guy also wrote, and there's a record, at least certainly Rothbard apparently is able to document that we know that Smith met Turgot. He did visit France, and he was able to read French. So that's why that's the puzzle. That's why, again, the guy was clearly had a few too many. He couldn't. He was incoherent. Again, he didn't. I mean, if he wanted to make an argument about the usury laws, at least have the good grace as a scholar to recognize that those who preceded you, who are very respectable, disagreed with you, and maybe see if you can respond in some way. But getting back to your point, of course, as you may recall, Mark kept saying, "Who cares?" Well, I said, "Well, the New York Review of Books cared. The the left-wing Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen used that against us. But of course, you're quite correct to point out that this moral argument is, if it's a moral argument at all, as you indicate, it's by somebody who's also, on the one hand, in favor of liberty, presumably in favor of liberty and free association between people, and yet he's claiming that it was okay for Smith to make this point because obviously there's something potentially immoral in borrowing at 11 or 12%. And of course, as I like to point out, as you know right now, President Donald Trump,
oh God, yeah,
the great capitalist who made his fortune in real estate, wants to impose a penalty on high credit card interest rates, effectively a usury law. And as I pointed out in a tweet, the irony is that they never go after the pawn shops. Do you know there are pawn shops all over New York City, all over the country, still to this day? The effective rate of interest that a pawn shop charges you is well north of 100%. But of course, I said, well, that's where people will go if they're shut out of the credit card markets. But then again, the problem with the pawn shops, I read, what do they accept? You have to pawn something, you have to offer something, and apparently they'll accept like an electric drill, But it's oftentimes people of limited means don't have anything really valuable to pawn, or of course you can go to the loan sharks. But then it's very unpleasant. The consequences are very unpleasant if you can't pay them back. Do you know that my father, who grew up in the Lower East Side, he told me everybody knew the loan sharks were all over the place. And by the way, what's interesting is that before credit cards, people of limited means could borrow on the installment plan. Very far more common than today is that if you bought a refrigerator back in the 50s, before credit cards were common, and for example, as late as the 50s, you could buy on the installment plan. But the implicit rate of interest that you paid on the installment plan, again, was like 30%, 40%. When the credit cards came along, people of limited means could borrow at much lower rates of interest than what the installment plan department stores were offering the average buyer. And of course, this was a huge leap forward. But now Trump, of course, wants to turn back the clock. He's shocked at high rates of interest charged by credit cards. And it doesn't occur to the guy that, look, if you're running a credit card company and you're allowing people to borrow, you're going to get a lot of defaults. There are a lot of people out there who just don't want to pay on the loan, and so unfortunately, you have to make a due allowance for the fact that you've got to chase a lot of people to see if you can get your money back. That's why the credit card interest rates are so high. Comparatively high, although they're still a lot lower than what the installment plan used to be. But here we have, again, Adam Smith saying, nope, 5%, and it's going to be terrible otherwise. But getting back to your point, was indeed embarrassing, and certainly of a lack on my part that I didn't pounce on Mark by pointing out to him that this is hardly a moral principle that you want to endorse, a capitalist act between consenting adults to borrow and lend, say, at 11 or 12%. We can't even forgive Adam Smith for that. He was hardly a classical liberal if he wanted to interfere with those transactions. So you make a good point as well, returning once again to my point that he was a drunken uncle.
In my view, Gene, his fundamental error that in many ways leads to the others is his view of value. and the labor theory of value, which ultimately, it leads to the idea that the laborers are being somehow ripped off by the capitalists. It leads to his view of rent. And Marx picks up on it with alienation and the idea of excess, surplus wages. I can't remember the exact term right now, where the capitalists are ripping off the workers. Can you talk a little bit about that, about Smith's labor theory of value and how it impacts the other things?
Well, as a matter of fact, there I'm going to give you a slight amount of pushback in this sense. Smith never quite states the labor theory of value.
No, Ricardo really developed it.
Yes, but indeed, well, because since you mentioned Ricardo, then we'll say that I don't even think Rothbard Rothbard probably does point this out, that essentially Marx, who does at times quote Smith directly and clearly read Smith, was mostly influenced by Ricardo, however, and Ricardo was in turn heavily influenced by Smith.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that really, to the extent we're going to blame Marx on Adam Smith, it's mainly by way of Ricardo. But that's damning enough, for sure. But indeed, Smith definitely, let me see now, where is the quote? Well, he hated landlords. Yeah. Well, this in a way is his most offensive statement about wages, and his flirtation and suggestion that basically the value of goods is indeed attributable only to the labor effort that went into producing the good. He writes, "The produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor in that original state of things which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock. The whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. Preceding it, in other words, the produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him." He's talking about this time supposedly before the capitalists and the landlords came along. He didn't have a landlord or a master. Had this state continued, Smith continues, the wages of labor would have augmented with all those improvements in its productive powers to which the division of labor gives occasion. Now, he's clearly saying that had the landlords and the masters, the capitalists, not come upon the scene, then there would have been augmentation, improvements to which the division of labor gives occasion. Now, obviously, that's an extremely ignorant statement, because clearly the productive powers that enhance the productivity of the laborer are clearly attributable to what the capitalist brings to the party, and indeed what the landlord brings. Come to think of it, I'll read you the landlord statement because that's the most vicious. And he writes, "As soon as the land of any country has all become private property," terrible thing, private property, "the landlords, like all other men, like to reap where they have never sowed and demand rent even for its natural produce. The wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which, when land was in common, cost the labor only the trouble of gathering them, come even to him have an additional price fixed upon them. He must pay for the license to gather them, and must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. The landlord then is clearly a parasite charging rent." Nothing about what people who own and acquire land do to commission the tilling of the land, to use the land to mine natural resources. Why people buy land, why they acquire land, mostly, of course, to bring improvements to the land so that they earn some profit from what that land can produce. The landlords who buy land and acquire it are strictly parasites. In those halcyon days before landlords, the laborer simply worked on the land and took from it what he could get and didn't have to pay this exploitative rent to the landlord. Now, in that case, we're supposed to forgive Adam Smith because, of course, in his day, a lot of land had been given to landlords, a term, of course, neither of us really like. They're not lords of anything, really. But a lot of land had been given to people who were favored by the king or by the queen. In other words, had been given to them as compensation for services to the king. Had not been acquired by mixing their labor with the soil, had not been properly purchased through capitalism, but still, that's hardly an excuse for Adam Smith to so get inebriated to the point where he's giving no acknowledgement whatsoever to the fact that people buy land in order to make some use of it. They become landlords in order to turn it into sources of food, in order to turn it into sources of natural resources. But before they came along, the laborer was just quietly, happily enjoying himself tilling the land. That's Adam Smith talking about landlords.
Like the noble savage, almost.
What?
Like the noble savage.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, the workman, indeed, yes.
Noble workman.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, by the way, almost the classic left-wing fantasy. The version, of course, the left-wing fantasy is a slightly different version of the story. It's that before the Industrial Revolution, people were happily living on land, happily farming. Nobody starved. Things were great. And then the capitalists, the robber barons, come along and they dragoon them to come to the factories and everything. And suddenly life is miserable for them. And it's a similar kind of left-wing fantasy to the way in which Adam Smith portrays the landlord. So once again, I go back to my incredulity that the smart people I've listed can so celebrate Adam Smith that Deirdre McCloskey can cross herself, like he wrote the Bible.
So in many ways, he demonizes rent, interest, and profit.
Yeah.
All the ways in which money is made in capitalism, aside from wages.
Yeah. Well, although, again, to put a fine point on with respect to the labor theory of value, there's no in the case of the usury laws, it goes on for 3 pages to talk about what would be the right rate of interest to cap the rate of interest at. What are the pros and cons? He discusses it, presents his arguments. The prodigals and projectors would be borrowing. The projectors, of course, and the prodigals, they're speculators. We don't want them. They would edge out the sober people. So he does an analysis. But in fairness, I could not find in The Wealth of Nations any systematic presentation of the labor theory of value. It's just that essentially.
But he does say that all value ultimately reduces to labor, doesn't he?
Again, sometimes his prose is a little clotted, I guess, as you can already see from some of the passages I've read. But I haven't found a passage in which it says, well, the first sentence of the book does indeed say that. Something to the effect that the produce of society depends upon the labor, but then he goes on to talk about the division of labor. All I'm saying is that I in order to present a labor theory of value and then the exploitation that's based upon labor theory of value, you have to talk at least somewhat systematically for a couple of pages
Well,
about it.
I don't quibble that Ricardo developed it, but I've just looked it up and it says that Smith said that labor is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. And
That's from the Wealth of Nations.
But he also,
Yeah.
doesn't he talk about profit being withheld wages or deducted from wages or some such thing?
Actually, it's in the passage that's the clouded passage that I read that he doesn't have a landlord or a master to share, and that had the state continued, the wages of labor would have augmented with all those improvements in its productive powers to which the division of labor gives occasion. In other words, had not the landlord or the master, who was the capitalist, come on the scene. So obviously, indeed, that's something else. I don't see he's precisely saying it's a deduction, but you are essentially correct. It's just that he states things that clearly imply the inescapable conclusion that the source of all value comes from labor. On the other hand, maybe you want to grant that in some of the good passages that I quoted, the brewer, they're sort of like capitalists, the invisible hand.
Gene, Book 1, Chapter 5, the title of the real and nominal price of commodities or of their price in labor and their price in money, he wrote, labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities.
Well, then I stand corrected.
Well, I know. I'm just saying it's there. It's implicit, though he doesn't develop it.
Yeah. Well, right. Yeah. The point is that the division of labor is something he develops for pages. He develops the usury log pages. So he tosses. Well, again, that's part of the reason why he wasn't writing this book in a sober fashion. But clearly. He tosses off remarks. He's confused. He doesn't really know what the hell he believes. I mean, certainly when we talk about the invisible hand and the brewer and the baker and all the rest of it, we seem to be talking about capitalists. He seems to be praising these people, although I guess this inspires me, I suppose, to quote this passage, which I think is of interest, in which he writes, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or some contrivance to raise prices. It is impossible indeed to prevent such meetings by any law which either could be executed or would be consistent with liberty and justice. But though the law cannot hinder people of the same trade from sometimes assembling together, it ought to do nothing to facilitate such assemblies, much less to render them necessary. So it's clearly talking about capitalists and what a nasty group of people they are, because whenever they get together, they want to harm the public.
Right.
They enter into a conspiracy to raise prices, and so he clearly is talking about capitalists, and he doesn't like them. But what we're going to say, it looks like you're going to say something.
I was going to say, which the enemies of capitalism are very quick to cite in favor of antitrust laws.
Precisely. Yeah.
I can't tell you, like I've heard so many times, even Adam Smith says.
Oh, yeah. Well,
even Adam Smith says.
Of course. That's the reason why we're leading with our chins when we keep calling him the father and the founder. But because I don't want to leave alone the big mystery about value. So let me do that
Before I just want to button up what we've just talked about real quickly with a quote from, let's see, of the component parts of the price of commodities from Book 1, Chapter 6 of the Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations.
Yeah.
He says, the profits of stock, it may perhaps be thought, are only a deduction from the produce of labor for the sake of the employer.
And then what's the next sentence? You got that? Yeah.
It goes on. It's an analysis of what he says. And then it says, it talks about how Ricardo sharpens the claim. Marx directly quotes this passage. But Smith does stop short of the exploitation theory. But I think that your point is well taken, that from Smith to Ricardo to Marx is not an irrational leap.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no. They read Ricardo read Smith and Marx read Ricardo and Smith. Yeah, but the value one is the craziest one in a way, because of what I'm going to explain in a moment. But let's read from the Wealth of Nations. The word value has two different meanings, and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object, and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. He then, perhaps I need to quote further, because then he goes on to say, classically, the water diamond paradox, value in use versus value in exchange. They're not the same thing. Water has immense value, far more value than diamonds have, but diamonds have an exchange value that is higher than water, and that's the reason why we have the distinction between value in use and value in exchange. The classically Marxist point. I took a course of the Marxists back at the New School. We want production for use, not for profit, not for exchange. Those two are different. That's why capitalism is so screwed up, because it doesn't recognize how important value in use is. And as I mentioned to you, I think when we were talking a couple of weeks ago. What's amazing to me is that anytime I talk to an ordinary person and I talk about the diamond water paradox, they look at me in disbelief and they say, "This was a big puzzle. This was complicated." Well, obviously, it's just that water is very abundant and diamonds are very scarce. We've got a whole lot of water. We don't. By the way, we don't have to get. You and I don't have to get cute with with the marginal revolution about the. We could talk about that, but why don't we just, for the sake of Occam's razor, make it simple and just say there's just a whole lot of water. Water is a lot more useful, but in fact, we know, of course, to use the classic example, that if we were on the desert dying of thirst, somebody offered us a diamond or a glass of water. We all know that. But here's the funny part. The two funny parts. Number one, Turgot, who also was indeed the French thinker who Smith had met, figured this out and talked about how and used the water and diamond paradox and said it's because we have a whole lot of water. Turgot even elaborated and pointed out that in the Arabian desert, water is going to be worth a lot more. So this was figured out by Turgot, whom Smith had met. But here's the craziest part, which I also told you. In lecture notes that were published from Smith's own lectures on economics before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, we read the following that from some student of his. I don't know if we even knew who this person was, who wrote the following in lecture notes that were published. It is only on account of the plenty of water that it is so cheap as to be got for the lifting, and on account of the scarcity of diamonds that they are so dear. And again, in these lecture notes, Smith goes on to talk about the desert, how water would be more valuable in the desert. Smith had already lectured on this point, had already figured it out, but then he forgot all about it when he wrote
because
his
he had a few.
Well, I'm using because I'm using the term metaphorically. This is a deeply confused thinker, confused to the point where he didn't even know what the hell he had said in his own lectures. And I hasten to add that there's absolutely no record that Smith had a drinking problem. So I'm only using the term drunken in a metaphorical way because this is almost the only way to explain the fact that this otherwise guy, a brilliant guy who could write some brilliant passages about capitalism and about markets, could get so confused about what he himself had lectured on just, like a few months or maybe a year before. So that's one of the things that's most appalling about Smith. And of course, when we can get back to the harm done by it, because clearly, of course, it's a very Marxist concept: value in use, value in exchange. Capitalism doesn't respect that. And that's why we hate capitalism. After all, we can find this in the founder of economics book, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So that's the problem with Adam Smith. That's why he is our great drunken uncle. I rest my case.
Well, you've proven the case to me. And it's funny that you said they talked about you shredded in the debate, because last night, I'm maybe a little older than them. So when I was driving around listening to the debate yesterday, I said, wow, Gene slayed him. Yeah. That was the thought that came to my head.
Oh, okay. So you're just an old fart. So you don't know the word shredded. Shredded is much more vivid.
Yeah, it is. It is. Then slay is shredded.
But again, we return to the mystery, which is why and Sowell actually has very little to say about Smith in any of his writings, but here and there he mentions it. But Sowell does indeed say he laid the foundation for modern economics. I just read that recently. There's a new book, a new version of Sowell's book, Discrimination and Disparities, which I highly recommend. I'm actually listening to it on Audible because I do far more Audible than I used to. Happily, it's on Audible. And it's Sowell's update of his very great book called Discrimination and Disparities. Michael Munger, William Easterly, Deirdre McCloskey, Don Boudreau, who I think writes some great missives.
He's great. He's great.
If I mention my heretical view of Adam Smith, he tells me to, come on, how can you possibly be contemptuous of this great man?
Gene, I got to tell you, I did not think that Adam Smith was as good, for instance, as the modern Austrians, but I held him in far higher esteem than I did before listening to your debate. So you have brought somebody along more toward your view as a drunken uncle.
Well, yes. Okay. Thank you. And again, I want, by the way, I should mention, it's probably worth mentioning that Joseph Schumpeter was the one who shocked the world. But Joseph Schumpeter was a Harvard economist by way of Austria, and he had sort of one foot in the Austrian tradition, and he was a good writer. He wrote a famous book called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, and he taught a course in the history of economic thought, and those lectures. I mean, he was writing the book, never really finished it from his lectures, and it was finally published. It's a little messy, but he was rather contemptuous of Adam Smith, and that was a big shock. I guess the only other point I want to stress, in agreement with Mark, in agreement with others, is that, come to think of it, I didn't quote Adam Smith. Maybe we should conclude on a positive note.
All right, conclude on a positive note. Go ahead.
The positive note is that if Mark argues that Adam Smith was far more influential than the Spanish scholastics, he states correctly that Adam Smith's work was far more influential than the Spanish scholastics or the French thinkers, because of course the English was the Brits were the dominant country, and whatever came out of England was obviously respected more, and so Adam Smith was very influential, and I granted to Mark that influence weighs in the balance, although obviously we Austrians, we free marketeers, do not want to forget pioneering work done by others. So it's a mixed bag. But Adam Smith on free trade did some superb writing, and according to Mark, he of course he went after the mercantilists. Who we needn't go into their mishigas, but they were against free trade. And of course, actually, we could probably call Donald Trump a mercantilist in a sense. It's very bad if we import things from other countries that they're raping us, they're ripping us off. So Adam Smith wrote the following about trade. It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. And what is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we ourselves can make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way in which we have some advantage. So he wrote ringing supports in favor of free trade. That was apparently very influential in his day. And we want to applaud Uncle Adam for having made that contribution to economic thought.
Awesome.
Yes.
All right, Gene, where can people find you?
Find me? Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, find Cousin Jeff. Yes, find you. Where can they find you?
Yeah, I was just thinking of that drunken uncle, and I was confusing myself with him. But okay, you and I are not an uncle of anything, so that's why I want to stress that we merely stand on the shoulders of giants. We're heirs to the great thinkers. We popularize them in our own way. It's an honorable role that we both play. But where you can find me is the question you put to me, so I better answer it. And it's in New York City. Unfortunately, I'm 81 years old. I've limited my travel. I used to go to Porkfest a lot.
Gene, digitally, they're not going to look for you. They're not going. I'm not telling them to go to your house. Where can they find you on the internet? You got on Twitter. Where are you at the Soho Forum?
Okay, now you've really blown it, because the fact of the matter is that, as you know, I do live debates.
That's true.
On the Soho Forum stage at 18 Bleecker Street in downtown Manhattan. And if you go on thesohoforum.org, you can buy a ticket and be in the audience and actually see me live on
That's
stage.
True. That's true. I stand corrected.
And also, I have an after party 2 blocks uptown from my home, from the venue, rather, at my home, my loft apartment, an after party that my wife caters. And it's part of the second mission of my Soho Forum. The first mission being to present one-on-one debates in front of a live audience with Oxford-style voting of issues especially of interest to libertarians, but also hopefully of interest to the larger community as well. Live performances. I'm an old-fashioned guy. You have to find Mr. Liebowitz only online, but actually you can often find Michael Liebowitz himself in the flesh, because he's a frequent attendee at my debates, and he comes to the parties as well.
That's true.
Therefore, Michael just really blew it with a question like that. Now, the other part of it is that you can find me on Twitter at Gene Soho Forum, where I post at least a couple of tweets every day on a whole range of issues having to do with often with climate change, with different issues of economics, with foreign policy, and even a few things about the Israeli-Palestine.
Don't start.
I'm just mentioning, not starting anything, just mentioning. Boy, is he touchy. Okay. Anyway, yeah. And so, so you can find me on Twitter. In the old days, of course, you could find me at Barron's Financial Weekly, where I wrote a column for 25 years. And I guess, come to think of it, if you Google my name, you will also find many of my articles that I wrote for Barron's. And in addition, you can find, if you go at thesoulforum.org and go into past events, you could find the 12 debates that I myself did. They're all one-on-one debates, 1 versus 1, never 2 versus 2. And one of my debates against the eminent Marxist professor Richard Wolff has just surpassed 8.4 million YouTube views. I've had other debates as well that you can find online at thesoulforum.org if you can go into past events. And then going full circle, the debate I had with Mark Skousen when he accused me of being, what was it, a fringe free market guy, as well as, what else was I? I was here it is. I was a socialist, a Marxist, and a free market economist who is fringe in a lot of ways. And then Mark went on to say that he doesn't use labels. He doesn't believe that was perhaps the most amusing moment. And I think Michael is endorsing that debate as a lot of fun to listen to.
Definitely check it out.
My son, who's going to take over the Soul Forum after I fade away, who's a vice president at Reason Foundation, which sponsors and runs our and pays our bills for us, helps pay our bills, has always asked, look, a debate mainly should be entertaining. And I correct the lad and I say, yes, entertaining, but also informative. And happily, I think that Michael is saying my debate with Mark Skousen, which you'll find if you scroll down to the past events.
I'll include a link of it with this episode.
It was both entertaining and informative. Yeah.
Yes. Gene, you're an absolute treasure, sir. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Well, thank you for bearing with my rudeness, with my occasional insults. They're done with love and with respect. And I'm sure you recognize that, and that you haven't taken offense at any of my acerbic words.
No way.
Soon. Okay.
Yes, sir. For now, it's the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.